It started out as a routine Coast Guard assignment. Two men, Nate and Russell, were sent to perform scheduled maintenance on a remote lighthouse known as Matinus Rock. Located far off the coast of Maine, the structure sat on a jagged patch of stone barely large enough to hold the lighthouse itself and a small maintenance shed. It wasn't connected to the power grid, had no plumbing, and the cell signal was barely functional. The lighthouse had been automated years ago, but because of its age and the harsh coastal environment, it still needed human oversight once every year or so. Normally, one person would handle the trip, but due to unexplained electrical failures, the previous year, this time two were assigned. At first, everything was uneventful. Days were filled with checking the beacon mechanics, testing backup batteries, refilling the diesel generator, and scraping layers of corrosion off the internal metalwork. At night, they read books, ate canned meals, and tried to pass time playing cards. The isolation was expected, quiet, boring, a little surreal, but nothing that raised alarm. That all changed on the fourth night. Nate woke up around 2 in the morning. He couldn't explain what had stirred him from sleep. There wasn't any noise, no sudden crash or storm, but something felt off. The air felt dense, like it was pressing against his skin. The closest thing he could compare it to was the moment right before a thunderstorm, when the atmosphere shifts and your instincts pick up on it before your mind does. But when he looked outside, the sky was calm, the sea dark and still. Then he noticed the absence of light. The beacon supposed to sweep across the coastline every few seconds wasn't rotating. It was completely still. That was not just a maintenance issue, it was a safety hazard. Ships in the region depended on that signal to avoid the rocky waters. Nate shook Russell awake, and together they climbed the narrow spiral stairs to the top of the tower. The gears that controlled the beacon's rotation were still turning, but the light itself was stuck, jammed. Upon closer inspection, they found the cause a dark, wet fabric caught deep in the gear system. It was heavy and soaked, covered in what looked like sea moss and salt-stained mildew. It smelled like rotting kelp, the kind of odor you might expect from something pulled from the bottom of a shipwreck. What disturbed them most wasn't the cloth itself, but the impossibility of how it had gotten there. The room was sealed, the door locked, and the windows closed tight. No wind could have carried it in, and there were no signs of animals. They removed the fabric carefully, tossing it outside onto the rocks, assuming it was some bizarre fluke. But that wasn't the end. The next night, at almost the same time, Nate was jolted awake again. The beacon wasn't moving. When they reached the top, another fabric was jammed into the same gear assembly. This one was different, a red, frayed scarf, soaked through and tangled with small bits of shell and sea crustaceans. It looked freshly dredged from the ocean, yet there had been no sign of tides or water inside the tower. They checked the locks, the doors, the tool shed, even the maintenance closet, but nothing appeared out of place. The scarf had no logical reason to be there. That was the moment the situation shifted from odd to alarming asterisk after the second night of finding soaked. Rotting cloth jammed into the beacon's gear assembly. Nate and Russell stopped treating their stay as a routine maintenance trip and started treating it like a containment operation. They began locking every hatch, securing every window, and blocking the spiral stairwell each night with heavy crates. It didn't matter how tightly sealed the tower was during the day each night. Something found its way inside or left behind traces that it had. Neither of them had seen anyone, and yet something or someone was clearly tampering with the equipment. They made sure to double-check the beacon room every evening before bed, locking the door tight and testing it. They kept tools nearby, not just for maintenance, but for defense. But locking the tower didn't stop the unease from growing, and it didn't keep the darkness from creeping in deeper each night. On the 7th night, Nate woke up and immediately sensed something was different. It wasn't just the quiet or the tension in the air. It was the soft whispering coming from the corner of the room. Russell, across the room from him, was sitting up in bed, eyes open, speaking in low, disconnected murmurs. His words didn't form full sentences, just fragments, like he was answering someone that Nate couldn't see. Nate called out to him, and Russell blinked slowly, disoriented, as if waking from a trance. He claimed he wasn't saying anything, had no memory of talking. Later that same night, Nate stirred again and saw Russell standing at the window, peering out toward the rocks below. When asked what he was looking at, Russell said he thought he had seen someone down there, a figure barely visible in the edge of the rotating beacon light. Someone standing motionless near the base of the cliffs, then vanishing the moment the light passed back. From that point forward, Russell's behavior deteriorated rapidly. He became withdrawn, stopped sleeping, stopped speaking unless spoken to directly. He spent hours each day sitting at the same window, eyes fixed on the sea, barely blinking. When Nate asked him what was going on, Russell would mumble something about noises coming from inside the walls, or voices whispering from the stairwell after dark. By the 9th night, Nate began hearing it 2 footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the spiral stairs from the beacon room above. Not creaking boards or shifting metal, but the distinct sound of one step after another, as if someone was walking just out of view. He looked at Russell, who was already standing near the stairwell, staring up with a pale, frozen expression. Nate asked if Russell had gone up there, and he just shook his head slowly, eyes wide. Neither of them had. The footsteps eventually stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it made Nate's ears ring. They both pushed a dresser against the bedroom door that night and slept with knives within reach. On the 11th night, the beacon failed again. When they reached the top of the tower, the door to the beacon room wasn't just unlocked, had been violently flung open, as if someone had kicked it from the inside. The wind shrieked through the opening, and inside they found the bulb had been removed entirely and set upright in the middle of the room. That bulb was massive, industrial grade. It took strength to unscrew it by hand. As Nate stared, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, he felt something cold brush against his back. He spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. Russell stood in the corner, eyes wide, whispering that he had seen a hand emerge from the wall. Not a shadow, not a trick of light, but a solid hand reaching through the bricks. Panic took hold as they fled down the stairs, locking themselves in the room again, but something had shifted permanently. It was the middle of the COVID lockdowns, during that strange, restless period where time blurred and every day felt like the last. With bars closed, events cancelled, and everyone socially distanced, people had begun turning to apps and random connections for distraction. That's how the narrator, bored one night, struck up a conversation with a local girl named Sophia. She went by Soph. They'd followed each other on Instagram for a while, but never met in person until that night. She was spontaneous and adventurous in a way that felt like a spark during a period of social stagnation. They met up, shared a few drinks in a park, and within an hour, she suggested driving out to the Montauk Lighthouse to walk the cliff trail behind it. It sounded impulsive, a little illegal, and possibly romantical, the ingredients for a strange memory. The drive took nearly an hour, but the conversation flowed and the mood stayed light. When they arrived, The lighthouse loomed ahead, quiet and glowing faintly under the night sky. The lot was empty. No signs of rangers or security patrols. According to Soph, she'd done this before, even before the lockdowns began, and there was no reason to worry. She led the way off the main entrance path, taking a back route toward the cliffs where the trail curved around the lighthouse itself. The structure towered over them, a historic and somewhat eerie presence against the otherwise dark shoreline. Its light swept methodically across the water, illuminating patches of the rocky terrain below. They used their phone flashlights to see as they climbed down onto the cliffside path. Rocks jutted out sharply and the trail wasn't exactly safe. But Soph moved confidently, having apparently done it many times. Everything felt surreal quiet, wide open, isolated in a way that only added to the thrill. They were halfway around the trail when she stopped abruptly and said his name in a low, uneasy tone. He turned to see her flashlight pointed behind them, its beam catching on a figure standing on the rocks a few yards away. It was a man, dressed in a long coat, with a hood drawn over his head. His face was partially in shadow, but from what little light hit him, he appeared to be a black man, standing still, watching them without moving. The narrator called out, asking if he worked there, maybe some kind of guard, but the man didn't answer. He didn't shift, just stared. Then, in a slow, casual voice, he asked, "Y'all want to buy some coke?" The sudden question shattered the tension in a strange wit. Wasn't what they expected. And yet, it made everything worse. The idea that this wasn't a ranger or worker, but a stranger lurking on a rocky, closed-off trail in the middle of the night brought a new level of danger into the moment. They told him no and turned to continue walking. The man didn't follow immediately, but as they moved forward, they could hear footsteps behind them. When they turned around, he was walking again, the same speed, not catching up, not falling behind, just keeping pace. The air felt heavier, the tension mounting as their footsteps became quicker and the trail narrowed. They continued down the trail in tense silence. Soph, walking ahead while the narrator kept glancing over his shoulder. The man in the hooded coat had resumed walking as well, never quickening his pace, never speaking again, just silently following at the same speed. The distance between them never grew, but it never shrank either. That constant presence behind them was like a weight pressing on their backs, and it made each step more difficult to take. Every crunch of gravel felt like it echoed too loudly. Every rustle of wind in the grass made their nerves twitch. The flashlight beams danced ahead, casting long shadows across the rocks. But nothing was as disturbing as the figure behind them moving in and out of the flickering edges of visibility. They hurried around a bend in the trail and finally exited the narrow, cliff-walk path into the grassy patch that led back toward the parking lot. It was supposed to feel like a relief, an escape, but the moment they stepped into the open, they heard something else, another set of footsteps from a different direction. Turning quickly, they spotted two more men stepping out from the dark. Behind them, there hadn't been any sound from that direction before. No rustling, no warning. They just appeared, like they had been waiting in the grass for the right moment. One of them said something they couldn't fully make out, the tone low and casual, but it made Soph's hand grab tightly onto the narrator's sleeve. They didn't stop to talk. They didn't ask who they were. They just started walking faster, breaking into a controlled speed walk toward the car. The first man, the one in the hooded coat, was still behind them, matching their pace, now joined by the other two who were closing in from the sides. The distance between them was narrowing. The narrator didn't want to run. Running would invite panic, chase, maybe a violent confrontation. Instead, they kept their speed just under panic level, pretending they weren't rushing, pretending they still had control. When they reached the car, it was like stepping onto a tiny island in the middle of a dark ocean of uncertainty. Soph fumbled with the handle, and the narrator slammed his door shut and hit the lock button just as one of the men reached out and pulled at the passenger side handle. Another man hit the back window with the palm of his hand, while the third stood motionless near the driver's side, just staring in through the glass. The entire car seemed surrounded. The narrator reversed out of the space quickly, not caring if he was driving over grass, dirt, or pavement. One of the men banged a fist against the trunk as the car pulled away, but they didn't follow. The headlights swept across them in the rearview mirror, casting distorted shadows over their faces, none of which showed any signs of fear or hesitation. The ride back was silent. Neither of them said much, and when they did, it was clipped and uncertain. The adrenaline had drained out of them like blood from a wound. Neither could really explain what had just happened or why. They only knew it had felt wrong from the moment the man appeared on the trail. Something about the way he spoke, moved, followed. And then the way the other two showed up without a sound, as if they had been part of a plan, a trap waiting to be sprung. Ian had been working coastal infrastructure for decades, a seasoned expert in remote site assessments and marine salvage. He had the look of someone who'd been shaped by salt water and wind-weathered skin, strong arms, and a calm demeanor forged by years in isolated environments. In 2013, he accepted a contract from a small county in Washington state to inspect an old, decommissioned lighthouse on a rock island about an hour off the mainland. The lighthouse hadn't been active in years, and the county wasn't sure whether to tear it down or preserve it. His job was to assess the structural integrity and determine if restoration was even possible. The island was little more than a jagged outcrop with barely enough flat land to accommodate the lighthouse itself, a storage shed, and some rusted debris left from years past. He was dropped off by a small Coast Guard vessel early Monday morning. The plan was to stay for 3 nights and call for pickup on Thursday. He packed light just tools, food, a sleeping bag, and a marine radio. He'd done jobs like this before and didn't think twice about being alone. The first day was quiet. Overcast skies, mild wind, and the usual scent of rust and sea. The inside of the lighthouse was intact, though dusty and long unused. Spiral stairs led upward to the beacon room, and below that were storage rooms and a small sleeping quarter. Ian set up camp on the lower floor near the generator, which still emitted residual warmth from the sun-heated stone. That night passed without incident, though he noted how oppressively silent the place was. No seabirds, no insects, not even the steady rhythm of waves crashing outside. The quiet was so total, it felt unnatural. On the second day, a thick wall of fog surrounded the island. It came in quick and settled like a physical object, cutting off all visibility beyond a few feet. Ian continued his inspection, taking notes and photos. That's when he noticed something odd. Halfway up the spiral staircase, there was a maintenance closet built into the wall. He'd tried to open it the day before, but the hinges were so corroded that it hadn't budged. Now, it was slightly opener, narrow crack, maybe an inch, just wide enough to see inside. He felt a chill when he realized he hadn't touched it since the day before, and the door definitely hadn't been open then. He leaned closer and shone his flashlight into the gap. Inside, barely visible at the far end, was a small wooden box, about the size of a lunch container. It was soaked, covered in damp moss, like it had just been pulled from a tide pool. The sight of it was jarring, not just because of how out of place it looked, but because of the immediate unease it gave him. He didn't open the box, he didn't even touch it. He gently pushed the closet door shut and made a note to report it later. Still, something about the box stuck with him. The way it sat there, undisturbed, in a place that should have been untouched for years, by the third night, Ian had reached the limit of what he could tolerate. The isolation, the strange occurrences, and the oppressive fog had taken a toll. He had spent the entire day rechecking his notes, convincing himself that everything could be explained by weather, rot, and time. But nothing rational explained the heavy moss-covered box moving from inside the closet to the stairwell by itself. Nothing explained the bare footprints in the dirt that stopped at the edge of the cliff without circling back. He had locked the hatch to the beacon room, reinforced the stairwell with a length of iron pipe wedged tightly between the steps and the wall, and kept his flashlight, his boots, and his packed gear next to him at all times. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, eyes open, listening to the building creak under its own weight and the constant wind buffeting the walls from the outside. Around 1:30 a.m., a sudden, violent crash jolted him upright. The sound had come from above, the beacon room. Something had slammed the door hard enough that dust fell from the rafters and the old staircase groaned. He stayed motionless, staring into the dark stairwell where the iron pipe still held the steps shut. Then came the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not on the door, not on the windows, but on the wall itself, as if someone were inside the bricks, tapping just behind. The plaster, the sound repeated, spaced apart, measured, and undeniably intentional. It didn't sound like wood settling or the building shifting. It sounded like knuckles. When the knocking stopped, it left a silence so complete it rang in his ears. He waited until morning before moving. When daylight came through the narrow windows, he slowly began checking the tower again. This time, the box was gone completely. The maintenance closet was wide open. The stairwell looked untouched, but the iron pipe had somehow been moved to the side of the steps, resting gently as if someone had picked it up and laid it down carefully. Ian felt a cold pressure settle over him as he stood there, realizing someone or something had been inside with him that night. He used the radio to call for emergency extraction, fabricating a medical issue to justify the urgency. They told him a boat would be there in a few hours if weather permitted. He packed his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and waited on the edge of the rocky shore near the drop-off ledge where he had first arrived. The fog hadn't lifted. It had only gotten thicker, curling around the island like it was alive, like it didn't want to let him leave. Hours passed with no sign of the boat. As the sun dropped lower, the air turned colder. At one point, he heard gravel crunching behind him, footsteps, slow and heavy. He turned, but couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The fog was like a wall, hiding everything beyond arm's reach. He stayed facing outward, toward the sea, refusing to look back again. Eventually, the low moan of the boat horn reached his ears from deep within the mist.